first part of the extradition hearing. So I will hand it over to you to kind of summarize what took place today, and then we will open it up to our guests.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining. So today we had the continuation of the prosecution's legal arguments. The case that they were making is that political offences should not be considered a exception under the or there should not be considered an exception within the hearings. They're arguing that because it's not included in the 2003 Extradition Act of the United Kingdom, that it should not be a consideration. And then in the second part of the evening, it was mostly, or the afternoon, it was dominated by the conversations around whether Julian Assange will be able to sit with his lawyers. So his defence, Edward Fitzgerald, raised some points. It was actually Mark Summers raised some points about kind of 6 issues that Julian Assange has been experiencing kind of throughout the trial, and very tellingly, I believe, we got a very kind of firm and seemed to be premeditated response from the judge, District Judge Vanessa Barista. So I'm sure we'll get into all of those points today. But I think today we've got a very esteemed group of guests with us today. So I'd like to hand it over to maybe Christian. Just kind of what's your take of the entire week, and how do you think everything went this week?
Well, I would like to begin of today's proceedings, because they were basically the most disappointing and to me, and I thought, and outrageous what happened today. First, of course, what you mentioned here was this argument by the prosecution that although they are basing the extradition requests on the bilateral treaty between the US and UK, they want an exemption from the exemption in the treaty which says you can't extradite on the basis of a political offense. And how on earth can you do that? How on earth can you base an extradition on a treaty? However, on the other hand, say, but that exemption in the treaty is not valid here because it's not in the local laws here, in the Extradition Act of 2003. Where everybody knows that the only reason why that was exempted in 2003, and there are examples all over the world after 9/11, to exempt that on terrorist or terrorism basis, that was the only basis that was left out of the change in the local law in 2003. But for I think since 1870, I think that was the example. Since then, there has been a political offense exemption in extradition treaties in this country and in all countries. And even Americans, they don't do extradition treaties with any country in the world without having that exemption. So it was kind of a weird argument, and actually to see that the judge seemed or the magistrates rather, seemed very interested in the arguments of the prosecution, although they, to me and for the layman who is not well versed in the law, it would be sounding outrageous. You can't have the cake and eat it too. That should be obvious. Secondly, of course, you mentioned the extremely disappointing sort of the end of the day, where the magistrate decided that Julian should stay in that glass cage on the back of the courtroom with little contact with his lawyers in the courtroom, that he would not be allowed to sit with his lawyers when the proceeding continue in May. That is an outrage. I mean, there was a very compelling evidence put forth by his lawyers, by Mark Summers. For example, a ruling from Strasbourg, from the European Court of Human Rights, about a very similar case, very similar circumstances. In that case, it was a court proceeding in Moscow. And the reason why that was considered by Strasbourg, those proceedings in Moscow, to be a violation of the rights of the defendant and in violation of due process and everything, were exactly the same sort of situation. Julian had a very hard time communicating with his lawyers. Actually, when he was trying to get attention, I mean, the lawyers are I mean, he's behind them. They can't see him. The only reason why they got their attention because we in the gallery or the people of the press were sort of pointing out, he wants attention. And every time he spoke to his lawyers through this sort of small crack in the bulletproof glass that is sort of separating him from the courtroom, it could be overheard by the Americans in the courtroom. It could be overheard by the members of the private company who are sitting, the security guards from Serco, who are sitting with him in the dock, in the glass cage. So everything that was presented there was compelling. A peaceful, non-violent individual who is guilty of nothing. He's an innocent man de facto. Is not allowed to sit with his lawyers. And the fact that the magistrate basically read out her ruling, pre-written, everybody saw that from the public gallery. She came in with her decision before she heard the argument from Julian's lawyer. I mean, that is such a clear example of the bias that he is facing there, and the decision of this court basically to do everything possible to make this as a difficult situation for him as possible, to humiliate him. It's a humiliating, degrading, and an outrageous circumstances that the entire proceedings are. I mean, I have a lot to say about the other days of the week, but this is just the final thing which we now carry with us, and he carries with him, in this waiting time until it continues in May, and it doesn't raise a lot of optimism about the future.
And if I may, I think it's important context as well. I don't know how many people are aware. We had a trial of Tommy Robinson, who was the leader of the EDL, the English Defence League here in the United Kingdom. He had assaulted a police officer, so it's a violent crime. He was allowed to sit with his lawyers, and that's a violent crime. It's someone with, regardless of a far right individual with had been found guilty of not even I don't think it was even it was post the fact that he'd been convicted of this. So I think that was more telling, or it's telling of the circumstances. Any other further thoughts on?
I heard somebody say that they had actually looked through Hansard, which is the transcript, of the parliamentary transcript, in relation to when they were discussing the treaty, and there was just no mention whatsoever about the political offences. So I don't actually know what that represents, the fact that they didn't mention it, but it certainly wasn't. It certainly wasn't barred.
Mo, I know you are our go-to for the legal expertise here and explaining things. Do you want to maybe touch on some of the more confusing parts of this? I know that yesterday many of the journalists in the courtroom were confused about the treaty and which one they are, or the treaty versus the act. Can you explain that for the viewers?
I think Kristen summarized it well. Just on the point, before I get to that, if I could just get to the point about being released from the dock, I did note that yesterday the judge made clear, at least from my understanding when I was listening to her, that she wasn't concerned, she wasn't bothered either way. She said, I don't have a problem with him necessarily sitting with his lawyers. It's just outside of my jurisdiction. That's a matter for the security to make a risk assessment. But she expressed a degree of neutrality that hey, if it were possible, I just don't think it's possible for a series of reasons. For technical, she gave rather technical reasons. Once she was presented today with clear evidence that it is in her jurisdiction, and that it has been done in the past, and there is precedence for it, and there are rules that permit it. She recognized that, actually, it's important to note. She accepted the arguments that she has jurisdiction, that there is precedence for it. And then she rejected it quite strongly on the basis that it's not necessary, that other factors can be taken. So I did note that, and that was one thing that sorry, you wanted to say something?
I wanted to add in that during this whole process, one of the the elements that was raised was that if Julian actually wanted to speak to his lawyers confidentially, they would have to, they could proceed in court for 3 minutes, and then it would take 20 minutes to go down to the cells and confer with him. And she said, well, I actually feel that's a bit of an exaggeration. And Mark Summers said, well, have you been to the cells? And she said, no, I haven't. I think that's insane that a judge sitting there has no concept of what the people in her court have to endure.
She had no idea about the security protocol. And another thing was really striking yesterday, that she actually turned to the prosecution side to ask about the precedents of defendants sitting in court, and whether the QC for the Americans had any objections to it, and they don't. So I mean, they're not demanding it. They said we're neutral on this. And when asked about other examples, they had to, of course, admit that there were numerous examples. So she knew that yesterday, and the magistrate actually got into a rather ridiculous argument with the prosecution side,
who was giving case law.
Yes, and we're asking them from case law, and said, no, you're wrong on this. Well, she was actually proven wrong this morning with the documents, but this is a bizarre sort of situation where actually the ones who are wanting the extradition of Julian are not opposing to this.
And even though he said he was neutral on the subject, it sounded like he preferred it as an option for him to be able to sit with the lawyers. I think because of the disturbance it has with the hearings for them to constantly have to break, but B, because they don't want Assange to be granted bail, and that was one option that the judge was suggesting. It's like, well, if he's granted bail, not that I think she would give it, but if he were, then he would be permitted. Maybe it wouldn't be a security issue.
The prosecution said that they would oppose that.
Exactly. So the prosecution was saying this is a happy medium. So, bail is a bit too extreme, but we think that this is your court. You can deal with it as you see fit. In fact, that's what he said yesterday.
They also mentioned a justice document, which I think that document relates to fair trials. And they said that 5 pages in that briefing related to the fact that to not be sitting with your counsel was not equitable with a fair trial.
Jeremy, I'd like you to weigh in on this as well, as far as what happened in court today and even throughout the week.
Yeah, I was actually waiting for the legalese to fade off, because as a supporter and friend of Julian, I came this week with the firm intention to not even try to enter this court and play this game of access and trying to fit within these hardcore security rules. And I remember sitting in the public gallery during the extradition hearing about Sweden in 2012, and remember it as a soul-crushing experience, where with these crackling speakers on these uncomfortable chairs above the court, you basically can't hear, can't see nothing, you can't feel nothing. You're reminded all the time that you are nothing. The whole architecture of this place is an architecture of oppression and soul-crushing. So I spent the week around with the amazing supporters who came from all over the world, who planted tents in front of the court. Some people slept there by 0 degrees and were there for an entire week, voicing their opinion, informing the public passing by, waving their banners, chanting, making some noise, so the people would know. So I got briefing from some of these excellent people here. I'm not saying that the details of the case themselves are not important, but my firm impression is that what happens outside of the court is equally important as what is happening inside, and that we have somehow to find a way to extract ourselves from the legalese, not leaving the legalese to the lawyers. Of course, we have to wade in, we have to bring our expertise, we have to make political points out of them, but we have somehow to take a look at a much wider situation. What is happening to Julian now? Why is it happening? What does it mean for the world? What does it mean for the future of journalism, or for the future of our own capacity as individuals to make sense of the world around ourselves, and to just express ourselves?
And I think, that's a feeling that I've had kind of a lot through the last few months is that, Julian's case to me is so symbolic of, how bad things are becoming in the West, and especially for freedom of speech. But at the same time, there seems to be a lot of maybe optimism is not the right word, but there are things kind of glimmers of hope in terms of the amount of support that people coming out in support of Julian, and hopefully developments to kind of keep that legacy of what Julian created going, because I think that's the way that we essentially fight this, is to say that, I mean, it's not to say that we're kind of resigning hope in Julian, but I think it's to say that WikiLeaks and this infrastructure that he built is not something you're going to be able to remove, and that work should continue, and that work has been continuing. Absolutely.
I mean, what is important to keep in mind? I mean, Jeremy is right. I mean, it's not just about what happens in the courtroom. we can discuss in details, all the legal arguments that were presented during the week. Of course, there was overwhelmingly leaning on Julian's side. I mean, if it was only the merit of the law, it would be an open and shut case. It just, I mean, the arguments are so strong. But I mean, the unease you feel in the entire proceedings, that you are being sucked into a mock trial, basically, or something that where the outcome is already predetermined, and all the arguments that we present, it's just a play to be able to give the establishment and the judiciary and the magistrate in this case some mock arguments and enabling to extradite him or throw this into appeal. So I mean, the important struggle is as much on the outside or as in the inside. We need public support, we need political support, we need public awareness, and the good thing is it has been growing. It's really heartening to see all the supporters who came from far away to be and even camp outside, the courtroom. All the observers that came from foreign countries, MPs from Germany and other countries. One from Greece. The one from Greece actually that had noted that she had not seen the layout in a courtroom and the sort of the chilling reality of what she was observing. It reminded her of Greece during the military dictatorship, and that's a message that might be quite valuable to sort of keep in mind. So, Reporters Without Borders, Amnesty, the Writers' Organization, Norwegian PEN, other organizations have been present, and I've been sitting there in the gallery for the entire week, and there is a sense of disbelief and outrage, a mix of that, of the entire proceedings. So, not too optimistic about the outcome here on the legal front. We need pressure from the outside.
Absolutely.
There
Just
was a
quickly.
nice moment this morning to add to what Jeremy was saying. So this morning when I arrived, which was about 8 o'clock, and they had previously all public gallery members and supporters could go in at any time, but this morning they had said that they weren't allowed even onto the premises until the family had arrived, and the court was only starting at 10:30 today. The family had reserved seats, so they were only arriving at 10:15. This was 8 in the morning. It was pouring with rain. It was 2 degrees. It then started to snow. Wow. And when I got in, there was a journalist and I said, this is outrageous. When I first arrived, I spoke to the guard. I said, is it really necessary to leave those people out there? And he said, we're just following the rules. And I said, well, that we're just following the rules has been a term used by many people to carry out lots of abuse and abdicate responsibility for it. So the journalist upstairs said, well, let's do an interview now. And within seconds, because clearly I was seen on the CCTV, 4 security guards came up to her, took her phone away, made her delete it, made her show her press pass. But the good thing was that 5 minutes after that, the public were let in.
I just wanted to reiterate the fact that it's important to always highlight the public support, and there's been much more of it recently, and many activist groups have emerged. I noticed that in my home country back in the U.S., we're seeing different groups throughout the country show support for Assange. I was reporting outside of the courthouse the past few days, and the first day was a really, really big demonstration, peaceful demonstration too. And there were 150 yellow vests there. And what it really showed to me was that people are united in this fight. People are very much against this U.S. extradition. And despite the fact that a large portion of the corporate media has really failed to talk about this case, perhaps in the depth that they should, we are still seeing people on the ground showing up and showing support. And I am optimistic, though, in seeing more journalists look at this case and realize that it really does impact them as well.
Yeah, and I think it is somehow our duty to tell this story and maybe retell this story. And I honestly think that, of course, we need support from journalists, but we also need support from historians, from teachers, from poets, from songwriters. Everyone in the world should feel connected to this case and what it stands for. And I'm a little bit frustrated. Well, for the last 5 years, you couldn't talk about Julian and WikiLeaks without being brought back to the stories about his personality, and he's maybe a rapist, and he's like this, and he's putting feces on the wall, and he's mean to the cat. And it took so much energy to debunk all these things until Nils Messer finally, shut the Swedish case with strong evidence that it was an entire fabrication. And but all this energy was wasted on him and his persona. And what I want today is that we go back to the fundamentals. We go back to the philosophy that brought WikiLeaks to life. A few years after the war in Iraq was started on lies, this guy wrote a piece of philosophy called Conspiracy as Governance, where he explained that governments hide their actions behind an increasing amount of secrets. And that secrets becomes the way of conducting about these lies and these crimes. And that if we could break the secret, if we could expose these secrets, then the governments would dedicate more and more energy hiding the secrets. And we would push the governments into some paranoia that would leave them less resources to commit their crimes. This is what WikiLeaks is about. WikiLeaks is this glorious encounter between hackers, the benevolent hackers, the hackers of free software, of a free internet, and their wit for using technology for greater good. An encounter between these benevolent hackers and journalists who actually want to do journalism. Journalists who want to demonstrate facts, journalists who want to research, journalists who want to expose and take risks. And this is what is on the table right now. This is what is at stake. This is why Julian is being persecuted today. This is why Judge Baritzer and the whole British establishment is trying to crush him in this glass box with no access to nothing. You reported already that on Monday alone he was handcuffed 11 times, strip searched naked twice, brought about 5 different detention cells, and stripped of all his court documents and personal notes. This is not just for some alleged release of documents in 2010. It is for what Julian and WikiLeaks stand for. It is about trying to alter this balance of power. It is about exposing lies. It is about giving the power to everyone to in part in these activities.
And this abuse of power started several years ago, and we saw that in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and the UC Global case was also brought up earlier this week. I know that both of you have visited the embassy quite a bit, so if you're willing to talk about maybe what the conditions were like in that embassy.
Well, towards the end, Kristen can talk about towards the beginning, but towards the end, it was a very sadistic place. They increasingly isolated Julian. They installed cell phone jammers. He had no access to the internet. He wasn't allowed visitors. They turned the heating off during winter. And on the weekends, when there was nobody there, no functionaries from the embassy working, there was only the security guard, they actually built a two-way glass box around the security desk so that he had no interaction with any human being for the entire, from Friday at 5 o'clock until Monday at 8. It was a constant incremental increase of pressure and isolation and vindictiveness in the hope that he would walk out of the embassy
and be arrested. Yeah, I mean, it was extraordinary to see this slow process from actually that being a sanctuary. Fidel Vias, the former consul and in the embassy, has been a good witness of how actually people were trying to coexist. It's a small compound, a small actually premise, but everything was made. Everybody was working hard on making this work, and it did work. It was a sanctuary. There was, of course, severe limitation on Julian, but we were able to come and go. We were able to work there, out of there, and keep the work going, and make it at least a bearable place to be in. Because I mean, Julian couldn't go out. There was no garden, just a small balcony that, it was really a serious issue with going out on that one. But when Lenin Moreno came to power, it just sort of there was a shift very quickly, and it became basically the sanctuary became a prison, very tough place, and so it's a torture circumstances. And of course, then the spying that we know of now. You see global spying on Julian, all bankrolled and financed by Sheldon Adelson, the biggest bankroller of Donald Trump and the Republican Party. And of course this has come up in the court this week. I have seen heard some of the evidence that it was is going to be presented in the Spanish case, including an audio recording of a meeting I had with Julian in the embassy. It is quite astonishing that that alone, eavesdropping and gathering evidence, sending it to the American intelligence on communication between Julian and his lawyers, should, on its own merit, be enough to throw out the extradition. And you have how many other equally important, strong arguments? I think there are probably 18, where each an individual one should suffice. So I mean, if this was a normal circumstances, not so highly politicized, it would be an open and shut case.
And just on that one point about the spying and the interference by private security firm UC Global, who were feeding information to the CIA, and actually, in fact, is beyond that, isn't it? It's also the fact that there were discussions about kidnapping Julian Assange or poisoning him as well. Yeah. That is that very type of activity which resulted in the case against Daniel Ellsberg being thrown out when Daniel Ellsberg was charged under the Espionage Act in the United States. The fact that federal employees broke in, I don't know if it was FBI, broke into his psychiatrist's office, pouring through, stealing his documents to see what they could do. Could they smear him? What could they find out about him? And the judge in his case had said it had been so poisoned by all the various illegal activity that it wouldn't be possible for there to be a fair trial. And that's in the end why Daniel Ellsberg ended up getting off. And he was a whistleblower who technically violated secrecy official laws as an employee of the federal government, or at least as somebody who's working with the Rand Corporation and the Department of Defense, whereas Julian Assange is none of those things.
And that was breaching medical privilege. That wasn't even breaching legal. Well, Julian's medical privilege was breached as well, with videos of his doctor examining him, but also his legal privilege with his lawyers, recordings of him with his lawyers.
The difference maybe is that back then it seems that some vague notion of rule of law and dignity of the court and vague respect to some of these was still prevailing. When here it seems we're in a completely farcical mockery of a trial. And not only the extradition trial here in the UK, everything in the last 10 years about Julian Assange, whether in Sweden, in the UK, in the US, in Ecuador, everything has been extraordinary and illegal. And it seems that what you said, Tarek, earlier, that the case of Assange is a kind of a symbol of our times. It seems that what's happening to Assange is a kind of a mirror of this rise of a global fascism we are seeing about everywhere in the world, where country after country, the institutions seem to be dismantled, the rule of law seem to be abolished, police states. I come from France, and France turned into a police state in a snap. Most people still don't realize what happened, but it has been written in the law already. What used to be a state of emergency is now the standard powers of the police. And as much as it has been happening over the last 10 years, we have been the manifestations of this rise of global fascism on our friend Julian, as if he was a kind of a lightning rod of the relationship between the people and those in power.
You can also, so taking exactly what you've said and translating it into the narrative that's been done, global fascism sounds really hard and wild and outrageous, and so as a result people just don't believe it. But if you look at the narrative arc of Julian's detention, it's been soft. The detention hasn't been soft, but it's been these small little technical issues, always a technicality as to why he wasn't charged ever in Sweden, why the prosecutors weren't able to come and question him here, why his asylum wasn't recognized by the UK, why even after Sweden had been dropped he couldn't be released, why there was a reason why he couldn't go to have medical attention in a hospital. It's constant, and it's always a little technical reason that is flagrantly contrary to their precedent or the law or anything that they've done in the past.
We all know the fact that you're right. I mean, there's a shadow sort of coming over in our days, very serious one. We call it neo-fascism, whatever label we're going to give it, but it's a strip of fundamental rights. So they are being stripped away little by little. And we can go through all the legal details of this week's proceedings, but what sort of sticks with me, apart from what we've already mentioned from today's proceeding, is this determination to twist and turn on the part of the prosecution. I mean, let's face it, this is a man, supplied by the Crown Prosecution Service. The arguments, the way that how far they are willing to take is to argue that Julian should be extradited is by dismissing all elements of international law. Not just the treaty itself, which they are, partly abiding by but partly dismissing when it suits, but also the argument that the European Court of Human Rights, UN Convention, Interpol statutory agreements, and etc., London Agreement, all these, and it's sort of blatantly sort of pushed to the judge, all these agreements, everything that's been built up, as an attempt to create an international legal base, some civility in international relations, they're willing to push that to the side and destroy those mechanisms, and with such blatant terms, and it's stunning. And they are saying it, yes, we have a special understanding of these terms of what a political crime means. It's an Anglo-American one. We know that every other nation in the world views this differently. We don't care. We do it our way. And despite the international agreement, despite the European Convention on Human Rights, despite all these commitments, just don't matter at all. That's how badly they want Julian, and that is the situation. So this is not just about journalism now, of course about Julian, but not about just what journalism, but about human rights in general. It's sort of the case is expanding here, and what is at stake.
And it's exactly that they did they ignored the Vienna Convention in relation to his asylum. They ignored 3 United Nations decisions on his arbitrary detention. Yeah,
Well, blatantly said in court. I mean,
that public international law doesn't matter.
yeah, and whatever the United Nations say, that has no bearing in my court.
Yeah.
Is what was presented by this magistrate in Westminster Court.
Which is ironic given the fact that the United Kingdom is a founding member of the United Nations. It also sits on the Security Council, which means it has a international legal obligation to implement peace and security, right? So the Security Council members are legally obligated to implement international law to ensure that international law is applied. And Britain does, if you see its involvement in international affairs, does bring up international law a lot. So it's not like these arguments which are raised here about customary international law and about the binding effects of certain legal instruments or legal policies. It's not like it's alien to this country. It's just that judges here, and this goes to the original point that you'd asked me about the distinction between UK legislation and the treaty, is that the prosecution is trying to rely on the principle that if there's a contradiction between British law and international law, British law always wins. That's basically the point they're trying to make.
Well, in this case, there isn't even a contradiction. It's just, it's not even mentioned. They're mute on the point, which means that there isn't a contradiction, which means that it can apply. Sometimes I wonder if the being on the Security Council, which gives you a veto right, also gives you a veto right to the protections that are supposed to be afforded.
Well, I spoke to Assange's U.S. lawyer. Mr. Pollack, who's a criminal defense lawyer based in Washington, D.C. And we discussed the fact that under the U.S. Constitution, it explicitly states that this country will be bound by the law of nations, which is the old term for international law. But he also pointed out that that's quite often not observed as well. Or there's the issue of standing, so that if somebody tries to bring up international law in court, the judge will just say, you don't have standing to raise this treaty right. So they exist in theory, but when you try to apply them in practice, it becomes a much more difficult issue.
I think the point I wanted to raise was kind of very similar to you, but I think even the rise of WikiLeaks and the rise of Julian Assange comes in a very specific context of Western society becoming more tyrannical over time. And I've heard this kind of expression being used a lot of, it's kind of the last days of Rome, where we're seeing laws and everything being slowly kind of being chipped away, and there's a fracturing of the West. We're seeing, Brexit, Spain, in France, it's fracturing. America looks like it's nearing civil war. With how polarized it's becoming. So that seems like it's happening in the West at the moment.
India, Brazil, it doesn't stop at the West, unfortunately.
And that's a very kind of grim circumstance of all of that. But I was wondering if anyone kind of saw anything that was kind of signs of potential hope or things moving in a more positive direction going forward.
Not in the court this week, not in my opinion. I think, it is almost an outcome that has been determined, as we saw today when the magistrate brings to court the decision on a ruling, before she hears the argument. This is the second time in a few months that I see exactly the same thing happening. For example, when Julian got the most severe sentence for skipping bail, and his lawyers came into the sentencing for that hearing with loads of arguments, mitigating arguments. Usually this is settled with a small fine or a very, very short prison sentence, which is usually not served. All the arguments that he was using his international rights to seek asylum, and that he was right to fear for his safety, to enter the Ecuadorian embassy, etc., etc. The magistrate listened to all the arguments with total disinterest, and then just took the paper that she had brought in her hand into the courtroom and just read out what she came pre-written. That doesn't give you confidence that you have any chance or any hope. But the arguments are there. I mean, what can we see? I mean, we have to fight on. I mean, Julian has to fight on. This will probably go into appeal, the Supreme Court, possibly, and even to the European Court of Human Rights. So I mean, it's a long process that we might have ahead of us. But and in that period, of course, I fear for my friend and colleague because he will not last years and years in this Belmarsh prison and the condition he is in.
Do we have time just for one more point on that, actually, because it's for whatever reason, there's certain things I think we're each affected differently. There's certain things that sort of stick in. And for me, the fact that the lawyers keep bringing up his prison conditions. I recall in November, they bring up his prison conditions, what's going on in prison. He's not getting proper access to his lawyers, they say, not enough time, not enough FaceTime. He's not getting access. The laptop, which took months for prison authorities to give him, isn't sufficient. He's not being permitted to handle papers or to be given papers for quite some time. And the judge's response was literally, I have no jurisdiction over the conditions over which he's held in prison. That's something to do with the prison authorities. Then in January, when Gareth Peirce presented precedent of, here's another judge who literally got on the phone and called Belmarsh prison governor and told them to intervene in a similar situation, and they did. She didn't consider that to be enough for her to then do the same. And then just the other day, as you raised, the fact that he was within a single day, handcuffed 11 times, strip searched twice, 5 separate holding cells that he's being put back and forth in, and then having his legal papers, his confidential legal papers, taken from him. The judge, instead of being outraged that there's this major interference in her court proceedings, and she could have literally have called the prison governor from across, from the next building on.
Yes.
She could have, because Belmarsh is just right there. Instead, her response was almost one of irritation that they had yet again brought up this issue of his prison conditions. Almost like, why are you, I've already told you. The fact that you're escalating, the fact that his situation's getting worse in terms of his mistreatment doesn't change the fact that I don't consider myself to be. So she could write a letter to the Advocate General. She could do all kinds of things. She could seek the assistance of the Chief Justice, Chief Magistrate, to say, well, okay, well, what can I do if there's a fair trial that's being interfered with by prison authorities? But she's just basically, this is beyond my scope. I think it's just beyond her interest.
And that was Gareth's point when she brought it up with her. She said, any comment from you would have significant standing with them. And it's noteworthy too that there's nobody disputing, not even the judge is disputing, that everything that is being said about Julian's access to his lawyers is true. It's, they're not arguing with that, they're just saying not my problem.
The magistrate, of course, then adds to it with that process by saying basically, that she doesn't have a jurisdiction to let him out of the glass cave, and she has to be forced actually into that position. Yes, you do have actually power to do so. So I mean, in every step of the way, where there's an attempt to sort of alleviate situation, she will try to raise the fact that she doesn't have any power to do so, neither in her courtroom or in the prison conditions.
Didn't the prosecution also raise an issue about the fact that, didn't they also agree that it's an issue that Assange wasn't getting proper access to his lawyers, or did they not weigh in at all on that?
I can't remember if they weighed in on that.
I mean, the fact that the people who are seeking his extradition to a country where he faces up to 175 years in prison, also telling the judge, yeah, it's fine with us if he sits up. In fact, we think it's better to resolve matters.
Well, it makes sense that they would want that. They would want matters resolved because that gives them a greater passport to prosecute their entire case and not have any allegation of interference.
Yeah, the appearance of impropriety. So at the very least, they want it to appear like a fair hearing. Just one correction: it's not a trial, because in a trial, you have no, you didn't say that. I was just saying, because earlier, and people,
I thought it was strange.
people during the week and the previous weeks have constantly been referring to this process as a trial. But it's not a trial. It's not a trial. In a trial, you have, in civil court, you have a balance of probabilities, criminal, guilt beyond reasonable doubt. And that is both placed on the prosecuting. In this case, the burden of proof literally is on the defense. It's flipped over. And it's not a fact-finding mission in the same way the trial would be. It's more up to Assange's legal team to convince the judge that the presumption in favor of extradition to the United States can be overcome in this case.
In fact, the prosecution even said, when they were talking about one element, it is not our business. It is not for us to determine the facts of this case. We are not interested. Basically, they're not interested in facts.
Yeah.
You were to introduce Fidel, I think, and at some point I'll have to answer your question.
Yeah.
But,
So of
maybe
course this is live television, and as you see, we all kind of shifted on the couch. That is because we are joined by another special guest, the former ambassador to Ecuador, Fidel Vias. If I pronounced that incorrectly, please correct it for our viewers. And thank you so much for joining us. If you could provide us with just your background and your perception of what took place today and earlier this week.
Thank you. Just small correction. I was not the ambassador, but I was the consul of Ecuador when Julian requested asylum, and when the asylum was granted in 2012.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
And I worked for the embassy for many years, and I was 6 years of the 7 years of Julian Assange inside the embassy, with him, seeing him at a daily basis, and doing my best to protect him.
Can you talk about the conditions in the embassy? Our other two guests, Christian and Joseph, were able to speak on that, but if you could talk about that as well. We know that UC Global, the Spanish security firm, was spying on Assange and others who were in the embassy for some time. That was brought up in court as well.
Sure. I will happily refer to that. But because I missed the previous discussion, and you were on the point of Julian not being allowed to be with his lawyers and kept behind a glass box. My only comment to that is that they want him in the glass box because he needs to look a threat. That's a question of image. A person who sits with his lawyers and interacts normally with them doesn't look so threatening, like a guy who needs to appear behind the box with 2 security guards close to him. So it's a question of image, I think.
Just on that point, and I think we're very fortunate to have people that actually know Julian intimately, and I think one of the main issues actually is the amount of misperception of who he is as a person. So maybe if we can kind of get some thoughts on, what's your experience of him as a person, and that.
Well, to start with, if I can begin, I mean, I've known him for 10 years now. We befriended when he was in Iceland. That was before the revelations or the release of 2010. I mean, a thoughtful, intellectual, a totally non-violent, peaceful man, just to add that. And the perception that is being presented, and Niels Meltzer, the special rapporteur on torture, has been pointing out actually, which is one has observed throughout the years, which is astonishing, that an almost a caricature image has been created of him, a villain's image in the mainstream media, and it is basically propaganda, deliberate propaganda effort. And it escalated, and it got worse and worse throughout the years. And just before he was dragged out of the embassy in this despicable manner, after this betrayal of Lenny Moreno, it reached a peak of where you were sort of presented in the mainstream media with an image of a total lunatic, a total crazy guy who was smearing feces on the wall and abusing his cat and what have you. It was just outrageous. you just wondered. I mean, how can you come up with these things? And all of us who know him personally, can testify to counter that image. I mean, we are talking here about a highly intellectual individual who has highly good motivations for his work, and it is just astonishing for me as a journalist for 30 years who have witnessed this sort of happening. And one wonders, I mean, you can take pretty much anybody and create a monster out of him in a concentrated effort. I mean, who will be next? But I mean, we've seen sort of in international politics sort of tendencies in this direction. The most, of course, the funniest example, if you can call it funny, is Gaddafi. Gaddafi, who sort of switched from being a statesman that Tony Blair could kiss on the cheeks in the desert and drink tea with him, into being a monster and then going back and forth. We saw Saddam Hussein being the best friends of everybody.
Bashar al-Assad.
Yeah, Bashar al-Assad. So that this is, we're used to that. But it must be of grave concern that you could just, and of course we know that this is a creation, a mental construct. It has no bearing on reality. Sorry for the long answer, but I mean, I would like to take that into that context. I've never equated the public image of Julian, and I mean, he's a rather shy person. He was in the beginning. He was very reluctant in the beginning, actually, to be in the public spotlight. I and my colleague actually had to sort of force him a little bit out because the WikiLeaks needed at that time in 2010 a face. So I mean, he was very reluctant, always very reluctant to be in the public spotlight. He is not a person that seeks it or has a vanity to seek fame or any motive that is spurious. So he is not the Bond villain, which he ended up being sort of depicted as in the end.
So before we do wrap it up here, Joseph, I want you to just give some of your insight on where it goes from here and what you expect this outcome to look like. Not a prediction necessarily, but just what we can expect as far as this extradition hearing. It's not over, and there's a lot more evidence to come in this case. And everybody watching right now, this is the Watchdog Live. We are about to wrap up our first segment, so make sure you do retweet. Make sure you also go to thewatchdog.net. There is coverage of the full Julian Assange extradition hearings there, my video footage and Tarek's work and many others from this week. But Joseph, I will hand it off to you.
So there's an administrative hearing that will come up. That just means Julian has to be brought before a judge every X amount of days. Nothing much will happen in that. There'll be a case management hearing on the 7th of April, which ironically also happens to be Daniel Ellsberg's birthday. And then on the 18th of May, we'll begin the second part of the hearing. That will involve a lot of live evidence. Today in court, in fact, they were hammering out the final details of witnesses and anonymous witnesses, and just to what extent they can and are allowed to be anonymous. So this will relate to the UC Global case that was brought to, there was evidence from which was gathered by whistleblowers who want to maintain their anonymity, of course. But you have to remember that the prosecution's client is the United States government. So whereas Julian was saying that his hearing is unequitable with that of the prosecution because they get to confer with their lawyers all the time, they, being unnamed embassy officials, who will then, during this case, be able to find out who those witnesses are. So we've got some anonymous witnesses to come. Oh, the point of that is that just how far up does that anonymity put those people in danger of being politically exposed and politically persecuted? We've seen from the defense team's opening just how much this case is politically motivated. There is a lot more to come. Very detailed technical arguments, anonymous witnesses, evidence giving, some very interesting stuff that is not necessarily technical. And We already know that irrespective of which side wins, the other will appeal, but we've got some very, very good arguments, and I think that there's greater precedent at the High Court stage for this to be something that could be won. I'm not saying that it will be, it can go further up, but stay
Jeremy,
tuned.
do you want to weigh in as well?
Yeah, I would like to maybe as my personal conclusion, but also as a way to answer your question earlier, to what is there here for hope, and also maybe to towards the end to extract ourselves a little bit from this dragging atmosphere, soul-crushing atmosphere of an extradition hearing and not a trial. Thanks, Mo. Remember, 10 years ago, collateral murder, the Iraq war log, the Afghanistan war log, the cable gate. This enabled each and every one of us to gain an unprecedented understanding of the world. And this is what WikiLeaks is about, using technology that is in everybody's hands to allow anonymous publication of vast troves of documents we can search into to make sense of in an uncensorable way. 10 years ago, we were still nurturing this dream that a free internet would make the world a better place, would enable us to challenge power. And in the meantime, it seems that the dream has almost died out. We've learned through the spy files, we learned through when Google met WikiLeaks, how this global consortium of governments and companies infiltrated each and every bit of the technologies we use every day, and how this brought about this world of total surveillance. Now, maybe is this tiny window of opportunity for us to bring the dream back, to bring this collective capacity to make sense of all that shit, to bring back a political message and not get swamped into the legalese, in a way maybe to make WikiLeaks wiki again. And as a matter of fact, is a wiki called challengepower.info as a homage to Gavin McFadden that has been put up online some times ago to help everyone who wants to participate. It's a wiki, it's a collective effort to help everyone to try and contribute and make sense of all this and somehow prepare a collective, uncensorable future.
Kristen, as the editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, why don't you leave us off with your final message?
Well, of course, we will continue to publish, as we have, despite the serious situation. Of course, we have to put our effort on saving Julian, because we are fighting not just for him and his life, but for a bigger issue here, basically the future of journalism, and in a broader sense as well, as I was mentioned earlier. Jeremy said we need to rekindle the dream, find the dream, the vision. For me, it's not an option. If we don't go back to that, if we don't go back to the core values and fight on that front, we have only other option is a nightmare and darkness, and that's where we're heading into. So I see this as a front line. This is the front line today. This is the line that we will have to take a stand, and that's why I'm doing it, and I hope more will join.
All right. I want to thank all of our guests for joining us this evening. We are going to wrap it up, but we will be returning the Watchdog Live. We have more guests. It'll be about 5 minutes, so make sure you stick with us.
Julian Assange's case sets many precedents. It sets precedents in relation to the suppression of dissent. It sets precedents in relation to the extraterritorial reach of the US state, persecuting a non-US citizen for committing the crime of journalism outside of the US. It sets precedents for freedom of speech and the rights of whistleblowers. It also sets precedent for state-sponsored torture and the collusion of different states to attack one individual. Today we are gathered, of course, to discuss some of the legal aspects of the case. And in doing so, it is my pleasure to welcome someone who has given a lifetime to a vision of a fairer and more just society. She's a fraud prosecutor who nailed oil giant Alpha Aquitaine when they were committing grossly inappropriate corrupt transactions. She's been someone with a commitment to green politics and sustainable development. She chaired the Development Committee of Parliament, of the European Parliament, the Development Committee of the European Parliament. She was a member of the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, and she was also on the delegation for relationships with Afghanistan. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Madame Eva Joly.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here. Julian Assange must not be extradited, and only a very massive mobilization of ordinary people and also of people from the law community can stop it, because it has been programmed for years that he should be extradited, stopped at Aranda airport. And extraordinary mails from this country, from the Prosecution Service, saying, don't you dare get cold feet. This is not an ordinary extradition case. We have all the proofs. This is not an ordinary extradition case. This is a political case. They have worked on it for years, and they are about to succeed, because the political situation is very dangerous for Assange, because Boris Johnson, he needs good support from the US. He wants a very good deal. And maybe Assange is part of the prize, as he was in the Ecuadorian embassy, where they put up a deal. We don't know what that deal is, but there is a deal. So I want to say to the UK authorities, we are watching you. The international community is watching you. And if you dare extradite Julian Assange, it is in your dishonor.